The wind howled through the barren trees, sending snowflakes swirling in every direction. It was a bone-chilling cold, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your soul, leaving a person feeling as though they had been frozen from the inside out. The kind of cold that made you question whether the world would ever be warm again. Amid the swirling white landscape, a small figure sat alone. The frail 6-year-old girl, Sophia, her long brown hair matted with snow and tangled from days of exposure, huddled beneath the remains of a torn, red sweater that barely shielded her from the elements. Her face, streaked with tears, was pale, and her eyes, wide with a mixture of sorrow and quiet despair, stared at the snow-covered ground in front of her. She clutched a photograph in her trembling hands, her small fingers tracing the image of a woman, her mother, whose smile, though worn and faded by time, still held a glimmer of warmth. A warmth that seemed so far away now. "If I disappear, will anyone care?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the howling wind. The words, fragile and hopeless, seemed to hang in the air. Her small body trembled from the cold, but it wasn't just the freezing temperature that made her shiver. It was the fear, the loneliness, the endless ache of abandonment. Her mind drifted back to the memories of her family, her mother's gentle smile, the way her father's hands would hold her close, keeping the nightmares at bay. But now she was alone in the world, and the only comfort she had left was a photograph that had already begun to fray at the edges. Sophia looked up, her tear-filled eyes scanning the snow-covered horizon. She couldn't tell how long she'd been sitting there, how long the world had been silent around her, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stay here for much longer. Her legs ached from sitting so still, and her fingers felt numb. But there was something deeper, something in the core of her being that told her she had to keep moving. The sharp crack of a twig snapping in the distance broke her from her thoughts. Sophia froze, her heart racing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Sophia tensed, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't sure who it was, but she knew the sound of footsteps in this desolate place meant danger. The world outside of her small world had turned savage, and there were people out there who would not hesitate to take everything she had left. Her grip tightened on the photograph. She wished she could go back to the time when the world had been warm, when she had a family to protect her. But now there was only the cold. From the haze of snow, a shadow emerged. Jacob Flynn, a soldier in his 40s, dressed in weathered camouflage, appeared from behind a cluster of trees. His face was hardened by years of war, his eyes carrying a burden too heavy for anyone to bear alone. His breath came out in quick puffs as he trudged through the snow, eyes scanning the landscape for signs of danger. And then he saw her, Sophia. She sat there, frozen in the snow, her small body barely visible against the whiteness of the landscape. Jacob stopped dead in his tracks, his heart momentarily stopping as he took in the sight of the fragile child. He had seen war, death, and destruction in its most brutal forms, but nothing had prepared him for this. The silence between them stretched for what seemed like an eternity. Sophia didn't move, her eyes locked onto the soldier. There was a flicker of something in her gaze. Fear, yes, but something else too. A silent plea, maybe? The wind picked up, and Jacob slowly approached her. Max, his loyal German Shepherd K9, moved beside him, its fur ruffled by the storm, its amber eyes fixed on the child with a quiet, protective gaze. "Hey there," Jacob said softly, his voice raw, hoarse from the cold. He knelt down beside Sophia, his worn gloves brushing the snow aside to get closer to her. "Are you alone?" Sophia didn't answer. She couldn't. Her body felt too heavy, as if the weight of the world had descended on her small shoulders. She wanted to trust this man, but the ache of abandonment was too strong, too deep. The soldier didn't push. He didn't force her to speak. Instead, he sat beside her, his eyes searching her face, looking for some sign of recognition. "I'm Jacob," he he said quietly. "And this is Max." The dog's name was simple, but it was enough to coax a small, wary glance from Sophia. She looked at the dog for a moment, her face softening just slightly. She had seen the loyalty in dogs before. Maybe this one would protect her too. Jacob reached into his pack and pulled out a thick, weathered coat. He held it out, wrapping it around Sophia as she sat still. Her eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, something in her gaze seemed to soften. "Don't be afraid," Jacob whispered, his voice full of an unspoken promise. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia didn't feel so alone. Before they could speak any further, the soft sound of footsteps broke through the stillness again. This time it was different. The threat was near, but who or what it was. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below, and if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. The storm howled outside the barn, snow piling up against the wooden walls like nature itself was trying to bury the world. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled softly, providing only a faint respite from the freezing cold. Jacob sat near the fire, his hands still shaking from the cold, as he pulled off his gloves and boots, trying to thaw his frozen fingers. Max, as always, was by his side, lying down on the dirt floor, his head resting between his paws, eyes alert but trusting. Sophia sat near the fire, her tiny figure hunched over the edge of the blanket Jacob had draped over her. Her eyes were wide, still haunted by the fear and cold, but now there was something else, something softer, hidden beneath the sadness. The little girl hadn't spoken since Jacob found her in the snow, and though Jacob knew she was too afraid to say much, his heart ached for her. He had seen it before. He had seen children who lost everything, whose world had been shattered. He knew how silence often spoke louder than words. Max shifted restlessly beside him, sensing Jacob's unease. The soldier glanced down at his loyal K9, meeting the dog's steady gaze. The bond between them was unspoken, but as deep as any friendship could be. Max had saved him more times than he could count, had kept him grounded in moments of terror and chaos. In some strange way, Max had become more than just a dog. He was family. Sophia, her gaze lost in the flames, suddenly pulled her knees to her chest, hugging them tightly. Jacob watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice low and gentle, careful not to startle her. "You know," he began, "I used to have a little sister. Her name was May. She was about your age when I left." Sophia didn't respond, but Jacob could see the slight shift in her posture, the way her body seemed to lean toward him just a fraction of an inch. He continued, the words flowing easier than he had anticipated. "Before I went to war, I promised her I'd come back. I promised her I'd protect her, and that I'd always come home." He paused, his voice faltering just for a second. "But I couldn't keep that promise. I couldn't be there when she needed me most." His eyes flickered to Max, whose head was now raised, his eyes fixed on the door. Jacob's chest tightened as the painful memory of May gripped him again. The promise he had made to her hung in the air, a weight that had never lifted, even after all these years. "I'm sorry, Sophia," Jacob muttered almost too quietly for her to hear. "I never wanted you to be alone like that." He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the heavy memories. "But I'm here now, and I promise I'm not going anywhere." Sophia slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide, as if she was hearing something she hadn't dared to believe. She blinked, and for the briefest moment, Jacob saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Hope, perhaps, or simply the first stirring of trust. Without a word, she pulled the torn photograph from her pocket, the one she had been clutching earlier, and showed it to Jacob. He took it from her hands carefully, his fingers brushing against hers for just a second. The image was worn and faded, but Jacob could still make out the outline of a woman's face. The face of Sophia's mother. "She's gone," Sophia whispered, her voice quiet but thick with grief. "I couldn't save her." Her eyes glazed over, and Jacob could see the weight of the words. The guilt that she carried even at such a young age. Jacob held the photograph in his hands, his own heart twisting in his chest. He didn't know how to comfort her, but he knew this was the moment he had to start. He couldn't fix the past. He couldn't bring Sophia's mother back, but he could protect Sophia now. "You didn't have to save her," Jacob said gently, looking into Sophia's eyes. "You were just a child. No one can blame you for that, but you don't have to carry the weight of that on your own anymore." He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm here now." "You're not alone," Sophia didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, as though trying to make sense of the words, as though she wasn't sure whether to believe them. The silence stretched on, heavy and filled with unspoken thoughts. Just then, Max let out a soft whine, his ears perked up, as though he sensed something in the air. Jacob turned quickly, his instincts kicking in. He stood up abruptly, his hand going to the rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the barn for any signs of danger. Sophia, still sitting near the fire, looked up, her face pale. She could sense the tension in the air. Her small hand clutched the edge of the blanket, but she didn't speak. Jacob took a slow, steady breath, his senses sharpened. He motioned for Max to stay low, and the dog immediately moved toward the door. "There's someone out there," Jacob muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, a snap of a branch breaking in the distance, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow. The sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer with each passing second. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle, and he motioned for Max to stay low as the dog instinctively crouched by his side. The storm outside howled against the barn, but the sound of the footsteps cut through the wind, steady and deliberate. Sophia remained still, her small body pressed close to the fire as she watched Jacob with wide, fearful eyes. Her hand still clutched the photograph of her mother as though it was the only thing anchoring her in the moment. But Jacob could see the uncertainty in her gaze, the way she wanted to trust him but was still so hesitant, so scarred by the world around her. The footsteps outside stopped. Jacob could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, the tension thickening the air. He took a deep breath, his military instincts kicking in as he slowly approached the door, his boots making no sound on the frozen floor. His heart was racing, but his movements were slow and deliberate, measured. Max was at the ready, his ears flicking back and forth as he waited for the order to move. Jacob's eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for anything that could give him a hint of who or what was out there. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the storm outside. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat and boots that looked worn from months of travel. He carried a rifle slung across his back and walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew the terrain. Jacob held his position, rifle raised but not yet aimed. The man didn't appear hostile, but appearances could be deceiving in a world like this. "You there?" Jacob called out, his voice firm and steady, despite the rapid beat of his heart. "Who's there?" The man stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Just passing through," he said, his voice gravelly from the cold. "I'm not looking for trouble." Jacob kept his eyes locked on the man, his finger hovering near the trigger. "What do you want?" The man paused, his eyes flicking over Jacob, and then to Sophia, who was still sitting near the fire, watching the scene unfold. Her small body trembled slightly, the fear evident in her face. Jacob wanted to move toward her, to shield her from whatever threat this man posed, but he couldn't take his eyes off the figure standing in front of him. "I'm not here to cause harm," the man repeated, his voice low. "I'm just looking for shelter." I've been out there too long. It's hard to trust anyone I know, but it's a hell of a storm out there. I've nowhere else to go. Jacob didn't lower his rifle. You've got a name? Marcus, the man replied after a pause. Just Marcus. The name didn't seem to ring any bells, and Jacob didn't trust the way Marcus was looking around, his eyes flicking toward the fire, toward the supplies in the corner of the barn. There was hunger in those eyes, a hunger that went beyond mere survival. "Why are you here?" Jacob asked, his voice hardening. "What do you want from us?" Marcus didn't flinch, but there was a brief flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just need to rest. I can leave in the morning. You won't even know I was here." Jacob didn't lower his weapon. There was something in the man's voice that didn't sit right with him, something off. Max's growl deepened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. For a long moment, Jacob stared at the stranger, weighing the options in his mind. Sophia was still silent, her gaze flicking from Jacob to Marcus and back again, as if trying to gauge the situation herself. The tension was thick, but the decision had to be made. "All right," Jacob finally said, his voice low but firm. "You can stay for the night. But you stay out of our way. No funny business." Marcus nodded gratefully, but there was something in his eyes, something too quick, too fleeting to pinpoint, that made Jacob uneasy. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I'll stay out of your way." Jacob didn't move for a moment, watching the man carefully as he moved further into the barn. But then, as Marcus settled in the far corner, Jacob felt his muscles tense. The sense of unease wouldn't leave him. He turned back to Sophia, his hand reaching out to reassure her. She didn't look at him at first, but then, when her eyes met his, Jacob saw something he hadn't seen before, something stronger than the fear that had gripped her. It was the first spark of trust, the first glimmer of hope in her young eyes. "We're safe here for tonight," he said quietly, sitting beside her and wrapping her up in the blanket. "I won't let anything happen to you. Not now, not ever." She nodded slowly, though the unease still lingered in her eyes. Max, sensing her discomfort, moved closer, resting his head on her lap. Sophia ran her fingers through his fur, the only comfort she could find in a world that had taken so much from her. But even as she sought solace, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. Marcus might be a stranger, but the storm outside wasn't the only threat they faced. And in the quiet of the barn, as the wind howled and the fire flickered, Jacob couldn't help but wonder if they were truly safe, or if the storm was only just beginning. The night stretched on, thick and silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the corner. Jacob kept his rifle close, his senses alert to every sound, every movement. The storm outside had not abated, and the wind continued to howl, but inside the barn the fire's flickering light provided some comfort. Max lay at Sophia's feet, ever watchful, his body tense as he listened for any hint of danger. Marcus, the stranger, had made himself as inconspicuous as possible, settling into the farthest corner of the barn, far from the fire and the warmth that radiated from it. He hadn't said much since his arrival, only offering a soft thank you when Jacob had reluctantly agreed to let him stay. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. The way he moved, the quick glances he threw around the room, the subtle tension in his body. Everything about him seemed like a lie. Sophia, on the other hand, had been quiet for most of the evening. She was still shaken from the events of the day, but Jacob noticed that she had started to trust him more. She no longer looked at him with suspicion, and her small hand now rested in his, as if seeking comfort from the world outside. Jacob glanced at Max, who was now resting his head on Sophia's lap, his eyes half closed but still watchful. Jacob knew he could rely on his dog. Max had always been able to sense danger before anyone else. If Marcus posed any threat, Max would be the first to act. But there was something else gnawing at Jacob. something deeper than the uncertainty about Marcus. Sophia had asked him a question earlier that he hadn't been able to answer. The words had stayed with him, buried under the weight of his own guilt. "If I disappear, will anyone care?" He had promised her that he would never leave her. He had promised her that she was safe, that he would protect her. But could he really keep that promise? Could he truly shield her from the darkness that seemed to follow them both? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft shuffle of feet. Marcus had stood up and was walking toward him, his steps slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching long across the barn floor. Jacob immediately stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But he didn't raise it. "Not yet." "Couldn't sleep," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough. "Mind if I sit by the fire for a moment?" Jacob studied him for a long moment, his gaze never leaving the stranger's face. Marcus's expression was neutral, almost friendly, but Jacob wasn't fooled. There was something about him that felt off. But then they were all just surviving now, weren't they? Surviving in a world where trust was a rare commodity, a world where everyone had lost something. "Fine," Jacob muttered, gesturing toward the fire with a nod. "Just don't make any sudden moves." Marcus sat down slowly, his eyes flickering to Sophia, who had turned her gaze toward him, though she didn't speak. She had grown quieter since Jacob had allowed Marcus to stay, her wariness still present, but softened by the warmth of the fire. "Not sure how long I'll be staying," Marcus said after a moment, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. "Just need to rest. Get my bearings." He paused. "The world out there, it's not the same anymore. People are changing." Jacob didn't respond, his mind elsewhere. He didn't want to hear Marcus's story. He didn't want to think about the dangers they had just narrowly escaped. His thoughts drifted back to Sophia, still nestled close by the fire, her head resting against Max as she finally started to drift off to sleep. The sight of her, the small, fragile girl who had once asked if anyone would care if she disappeared, stirred something deep within Jacob. The emptiness in his heart, the sorrow of losing his own family, felt like a distant echo now. He had made a promise to Sophia, and he intended to keep it. But how? Before he could dwell further on the thought, the sound of footsteps broke through his mind. They were quiet, but unmistakable. Jacob turned sharply toward the door. Max had gotten up, his body tense, his ears flattened against his head. The dog was ready. The storm outside was deafening, but in that moment it felt like everything else had gone silent. Jacob's hand was on his rifle now, his eyes scanning the doorway. The footsteps were getting closer, and then there was a sudden crash, something heavy hitting the barn door from the outside. Max growled low, a deep rumble in his chest. Jacob stood up, his body coiled, every muscle ready for action. He motioned to Sophia without a word, silently urging her to stay low and keep quiet. The crash came again, and the barn door shook. Jacob could hear it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force their way in. He didn't hesitate. "Get ready," he whispered to Max. Then he moved swiftly toward the door, his rifle raised. Marcus was on his feet now, his eyes flicking to Jacob, his face unreadable. "You're expecting someone?" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. The danger was here, and all that mattered now was making sure Sophia was safe. The door rattled again, and then, with a loud snap, it burst open. The barn door splintered, the wood groaning as something or someone pushed against it with force. The gusts of wind and snow from outside seemed to funnel into the barn, swirling violently around the space, but all Jacob could focus on was the door. His pulse quickened, his grip tightening around his rifle. Max stood beside him, his body tense, growling low and deep, eyes fixed on the door as he waited for the signal to attack. Sophia was still hidden behind the corner of the barn, her wide eyes peeking out, her hand clutching Max's fur. She had been silent since the crash, her fear evident in the way she trembled, but Jacob could see the courage in her eyes now, the way she was silently willing herself to stay strong. Jacob took one last breath, steadying himself. He glanced at Marcus, who was still standing by the fire, his face unreadable, but Jacob could see the shift in his posture, ready but not committed. Was Marcus a threat, or was he just another survivor caught in the same web of uncertainty? "Stay down, Sophia," Jacob whispered, his voice low but firm. He didn't need to look at her to know she was listening. He just needed to focus on what was coming through that door. Another crash. The door buckled once more, and Jacob knew they couldn't wait any longer. He motioned for Max to move, and without hesitation, the dog sprang forward, his growl sharpening as he darted toward the door, teeth bared. The moment was upon them. Jacob moved with a practiced speed, his boots crunching in the snow as he pressed against the barn wall, positioning himself just out of sight from the door, his rifle aimed toward the gap, ready for whatever, or whoever, was about to enter. The door splintered open fully with one final violent push, revealing a figure standing in the snowstorm. A man. His silhouette was dark against the flurry of snow, his body shrouded in a long, tattered coat. His eyes flickered toward Jacob and then to Max, who had now locked onto him with a snarl. "Easy, boy," the man said, his voice low but calm. He held his hands out, palms up, not in surrender, but in a gesture of warning. Jacob didn't lower his rifle. "Who are you?" The man paused for a moment, his eyes glancing over the barn, settling briefly on Sophia, who was crouched behind the fire, trembling in the shadows. His gaze softened for a moment before he spoke again. "Name's Lyle," he said. "I don't mean any harm. I mean just looking for shelter. The storm's too much out there." His voice was rough, but there was something about it. Something raw, like he'd been through hell and back. Jacob's mind raced. The storm outside was one thing, but the man standing before him, Lyle, seemed far too calm, far too collected for someone who had just emerged from the wild. Something didn't sit right. "Why are you out there alone?" Jacob asked, his tone sharp, eyes narrowing. "Who else is with you?" Lyle took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow as he did so, but still kept his distance. Max was on alert, his body coiled, ready to strike. "No one else." "Just me," Lyle replied, his eyes scanning the barn, the crackling fire, the exhausted faces of the people sheltering inside. His gaze lingered on Sophia for a moment, and Jacob could sense the unspoken thoughts in the man's mind. "I don't trust people much these days, but the storm... I couldn't survive out there, just need to rest, and then I'll be gone." Jacob didn't lower his rifle, but he could see the man was telling the truth about one thing. He was desperate. And in a world like this, desperation was often more dangerous than malice. Sophia slowly stood, her small frame trembling but determined, and Jacob felt the subtle shift in the air, the protective instinct flaring inside him. He couldn't risk her safety for the sake of a stranger. "No one leaves here until I'm sure it's safe," Jacob said, his voice unwavering. "You can stay for now, but if you try anything..." His eyes hardened. "I'll deal with you." Lyle raised his hands again, his expression unreadable but calm. "I understand. I'm not here to cause trouble." He looked at Sophia, who had moved to stand behind Jacob, still clutching Max's fur. The dog was watching Lyle with a quiet, alert intensity. "I just didn't want to die out there." For a long moment, the only sound in the barn was the crackle of the fire and the howling of the storm outside. Jacob held Lyle's gaze, and after a tense pause, he lowered his rifle slightly, but his hand stayed close, ready to raise it at a moment's notice. "I'll stay by the fire," Lyle said, stepping cautiously into the room. "I won't be a problem. Just need a warm place to rest." Jacob nodded curtly, but his eyes didn't leave him. He motioned toward the far side of the barn, away from Sophia and Max. "You stay there." Lyle complied, sitting near the fire but keeping a respectful distance from Jacob and Sophia. Max continued to watch him, his body still tense, and Jacob stayed vigilant. He didn't trust easily. He couldn't afford to, not with Sophia in his care. The storm raged on outside, but for Jacob, the battle was just beginning. He had made a promise to protect Sophia, to give her the family she had lost, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even a desperate stranger, threaten that. As Lyle settled near the fire, Jacob turned to look at Sophia, her face still filled with fear, but also something else, something he hadn't seen before. A spark of hope. It was faint, but it was there. "We're going to be okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But deep down, he knew this was just the calm before the storm. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the barn's dim interior. Jacob's eyes never left Lyle, even as the man settled on the far side of the room, seemingly unbothered by the tension in the air. Max continued to watch him intently, his posture still alert, muscles coiled, ready to spring at the slightest provocation. The wind howled outside, shaking the barn walls, the storm unabated. The light from the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the wooden beams, but it couldn't hold the cold at bay. Sophia, wrapped in a heavy blanket, remained by the fire, her small form trembling, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty that had begun to creep into her heart. Jacob saw it in her eyes, the hesitation, the lingering fear. She had been abandoned before, and the thought that she might be abandoned again, or worse, might have to witness another betrayal, weighed heavily on her. "Why don't you get some rest, Sophia?" Jacob said softly, trying to ease her mind. He kneeled beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, offering her comfort in the only way he knew how. "I'm right here." She nodded, but her eyes darted nervously toward Lyle, who was still sitting cross-legged by the fire, silently watching them. Jacob could see the unease in her expression, the same unease that had kept him on edge since he allowed the stranger into their midst. But he had made a choice, and now he would stick to it, no matter how hard it got. Sophia slowly lay down on the blanket, pulling it up to her chin. She didn't speak, but Jacob could see her eyes flicker between the stranger and himself. She was trying to trust him, but the fear of being let down again, of being betrayed, was too great. She had no way of knowing if Lyle was friend or foe. "Everything's going to be okay," Jacob repeated, though even he didn't entirely believe the words. He had no guarantees, no promises to give, except the ones he had already made, to protect her, to keep her safe. That was all he could do now. Outside, the storm intensified. The wind howled like an angry animal, and Jacob knew they couldn't stay in the barn for much longer. They would have to move soon, find another place to shelter, before the storm took full hold of the land. But for now, they were trapped here with Lyle, a man whose motives Jacob wasn't sure of. The door creaked. Jacob's head snapped up at the sound, his hand automatically moving to his rifle, but it wasn't the wind this time. A shadow had appeared in the doorway, blocking out the faint light from the storm. For a moment, the barn seemed to hold its breath. Lyle began, standing and brushing snow from his coat, his voice shaky. I need to step outside for a moment. I promise I won't go far." Jacob was instantly on guard. He hadn't given Lyle permission to leave the barn, and something about his sudden request felt off, like he was trying to slip away unnoticed. Max's growl deepened, a warning to Lyle, and Jacob's instincts kicked in. "No," Jacob said firmly, his voice like ice. "You stay inside. We're not letting anyone leave until the storm's over." Lyle hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking nervously toward Jacob. But then, to Jacob's surprise, the man nodded. He didn't argue. He simply lowered his gaze and returned to his spot by the fire. The unease inside Jacob only deepened. He didn't trust this man, not even for a second. And yet, there was something compelling about Lyle, something that made him hesitate before making a move. Lyle wasn't just a survivor, he was someone who knew how to read people, knew how to get under their skin without them even realizing it. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Lyle had his own agenda. The fire crackled again, and Max's growl softened into a low whine as the dog's attention turned to the door. Jacob was about to ask what was wrong when he heard it. Footsteps in the snow, a faint, crunching sound just beyond the barn's threshold. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. "Stay here," Jacob said, his voice sharp as he moved toward the door. His heart was racing, adrenaline flooding his veins. He couldn't ignore the danger anymore. He could feel it, just on the other side of that door. Max stood at attention, his muscles tense, his eyes locked on the door, as if he, too, knew something was coming. With careful, silent steps, Jacob approached the entrance. The storm outside howled louder, but the footsteps remained clear, moving closer. His fingers brushed against the door handle, but before he could pull it open, Lyle spoke. "Who's out there?" His voice was a little too calm, too measured. Jacob shot him a look, his eyes narrowing. "Stay back." But Lyle stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was trying to stay in control of the situation. "I'm not going to let you face this alone," he said, stepping closer to Jacob. "We're all in this together, right?" Before Jacob could respond, the door shook once more, a powerful thud shaking the wood and the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, slamming against it. Jacob instinctively pulled Max back, his rifle raised as he swung the door open. The wind outside battered him as the door swung wide, but there was no one there, just the storm, the swirling snow, and the crushing cold. The door creaked closed behind Jacob, the violent wind biting at his exposed skin as the snow swirled around him. His heart was still racing, but the storm outside seemed to have stolen his breath. There was nothing, no figure, no movement, nothing but the endless white blanket of snow whirling like a living thing, wild and uncontrollable. Max's growl echoed through the barn, low and throaty, still on edge despite the apparent absence of a visible threat. Jacob stood there for a moment, rifle in hand, his mind spinning. What was going on? Who or what had just attacked the barn door? He glanced over his shoulder at Lyle, who was still standing near the fire, his face unreadable, his hands resting on his knees. Lyle's posture was too casual, too composed for someone who had just seen a potential danger. Jacob didn't trust him. He never had. But there was no time for second-guessing. Sophia was his priority. Jacob's thoughts shifted immediately to her. He turned to the corner where she had been huddling by the fire. But to his surprise, she was gone. "Sophia!" His voice broke the silence, sharp with a tinge of panic. Max immediately stood, ears perked, and his eyes began to scan the room. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, and he stepped quickly toward the shadows. Where had she gone? "Sophia!" he called again, but his voice was swallowed by the wind that howled through the cracks in the barn's walls. He hurried to the back of the barn, his boots crunching the snow on the floor as he searched every corner. He didn't hear any movement. No reply. His mind raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Had she run off? Had something frightened her so much that she'd run out into the storm alone? Then through the darkness, Max's sharp bark cut through the silence. The dog bolted toward the barn door, its body low to the ground as it moved toward something, or someone, outside. Jacob's heart dropped. Without thinking, he rushed toward the door. He threw it open once again, stepping into the storm, his rifle raised in front of him. The wind howled like an angry beast, biting into his skin, but Max was already ahead of him, bounding through the snow, his nose to the ground, leading him. The storm made everything a blur, but through the swirling snow, Jacob saw a small figure stumbling through the drifts. Sophia. Her figure was silhouetted against the blinding white, her movements slow, unsteady, her small body swaying with exhaustion. "Sophia!" Jacob shouted again, but his voice was lost to the wind. He ran, his legs burning, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not now. not after everything they had been through. Max reached her first, circling around her and barking, but Sophia didn't respond. She was too cold, too distant, her eyes glazed over as she looked up at Jacob with confusion and fear. "Sophia!" Jacob reached her, kneeling down beside her, his hands grasping her shoulders. "What are you doing out here? You have to come inside, it's too dangerous." Her small frame trembled in his arms, but she didn't speak. She didn't say anything at all. Her lips were cracked from the cold, her skin pale, her eyes lost. It was as though the storm had swallowed her up, and the little girl he had promised to protect had become a mere shadow of herself. "Sophia, look at me," Jacob said, shaking her gently, desperate for some sign of life, some response. "I'm not going to leave you. Do you hear me? I won't leave you." Her eyes flickered up at him, but there was nothing there, only the overwhelming emptiness. Max nudged Sophia gently, and that seemed to pull her back from whatever dark place she had drifted to. She blinked slowly, her hand reaching out and touching Max's fur, but her movements were sluggish, as if her body wasn't fully aware of what was happening. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you back inside," Jacob said softly, his voice breaking slightly. He lifted her into his arms, his heart aching as he felt her tiny body shivering, her weight so much more than it should have been for a girl so young. She was barely conscious, the cold having taken hold of her far too strongly. He turned, carrying her back toward the barn, Max trotting alongside them, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter for any more threats. But as they neared the barn door, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was still a sense of unease in the air, a quiet, creeping dread. Lyle was waiting by the door when Jacob returned with Sophia. The stranger's expression was unreadable, but Jacob noticed the way his eyes flickered to Sophia, to the vulnerable girl in his arms. "Is she all right?" Lyle asked, his tone oddly neutral, but Jacob could see the faint glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Stay away from her!" Jacob snapped, his protective instincts flaring. He didn't trust this man, and he wasn't going to allow him anywhere near Sophia. "You've done enough." Lyle raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just asking." "She looks sick." Jacob didn't respond. He carried Sophia to the fire, gently laying her down on the blanket, his eyes never leaving Lyle. The fire's warmth didn't seem to reach Sophia. She lay still, her breath shallow and slow. "Sophia," Jacob whispered, his hand pressing against her forehead. She was burning with fever. Her eyes fluttered open again, but this time there was something different, something more present. She was still with him, still holding on, but barely. I don't want to be alone," she whispered, her voice so faint that Jacob could barely hear her over the storm outside. "I'm here," he whispered back, brushing her damp hair from her face. "I'm here." "You're not alone." Max sat by her side, his head resting on her lap, as if offering his own quiet reassurance. But the storm was not over, and neither was the fight for Sophia's survival. The storm continued its relentless assault on the barn, but inside the warmth of the fire flickered weakly against the biting cold. Jacob sat beside Sophia, his hand resting lightly on her forehead, feeling the heat of her fever radiating from her fragile body. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. The wind outside howled like a living thing, but inside the barn there was only the quiet crackle of the fire and the faint, steady breathing of Max, who remained ever watchful by Sophia's side. His head rested on her lap, a silent sentinel, as the girl slept fitfully, her body trembling with the fever that had gripped her. Jacob had never been so helpless. He could fight, he could survive. But when it came to saving Sophia, when it came to being her protector, he felt out of his depth. The promise he had made to her, not to let her down, seemed to be slipping further from his reach with each passing moment. He had already failed once before, and now, as Sophia lay there, sick and alone, he couldn't shake the weight of that failure. but he would try. He would never give up on her. "Sophia," he whispered, brushing a lock of her damp hair from her face. "Stay with me. You're stronger than this. You've got this." His words were more for himself than for her, as though if he said them enough, he could convince himself that things would be all right. The door creaked, breaking the fragile silence. Lyle stepped into the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate, as though he had been watching from the shadows. Jacob didn't even look up. He wasn't in the mood to deal with the stranger, but Lyle had been there since the beginning, and now he wasn't sure how to handle him. "I don't want to intrude," Lyle said quietly, his voice carrying the hint of concern, though Jacob wasn't sure how genuine it was. "But if you've got any more supplies, I might be able to help." Jacob turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes. Lyle stood at a distance, his posture tense. There was something about the man that still didn't sit right with him. "I'm not interested," Jacob snapped, his voice low but firm. "You can stay, but stay away from her." Lyle didn't move. "You're not thinking straight. She's burning up. I've seen this before. We don't have much time." Jacob's gaze hardened. He had already done everything he could. The small stash of supplies they had was barely enough to get them through the storm. He couldn't trust Lyle. He couldn't trust anyone, but if there was even the smallest chance that the man might be able to help, then Jacob couldn't afford to ignore it. "What do you suggest?" Jacob asked, though he didn't want to hear the answer. He had been doing everything in his power to keep Sophia safe, but it wasn't enough. Lyle stepped forward, lowering his voice as he knelt beside Sophia. "She's burning with fever. The cold and the stress, it's too much. If we don't cool her down and get her some warmth, we'll lose her. She's not going to last through this night unless we do something." His hands hovered over Sophia, his eyes studying her closely. "You've got blankets. That's good, but she needs water. She needs something to bring down the fever." Jacob clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to push Lyle away. This wasn't a time to argue. This was a time to act. With a resigned sigh, he stood up, feeling the weight of his exhaustion in every movement. "Do what you can," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "but keep your distance." Lyle nodded, moving quickly and efficiently as he began gathering the supplies he could find. He muttered to himself as he worked, his hands moving in practiced motions as he prepared a mixture of herbs and water to help bring Sophia's fever down. Jacob stood back, watching. He didn't trust Lyle, but if he was right, this could be their only chance. Sophia's body was already frail, the fever burning through her system like wildfire. Without help, she wouldn't make it. As Lyle worked, Jacob's gaze shifted toward the door. The storm outside raged on, but it was a different kind of battle now, the battle for Sophia's life. The storm was no longer just the wind and snow. It was the uncertainty of the future, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to protect her from the world that seemed intent on breaking them. But as he watched Max gently nudge Sophia's side, his heart softened. The dog had been a constant presence through it all, his loyalty unshakable. And so had Jacob's resolve. "Sophia," Jacob whispered again, more to himself than to her. "We're going to make it." "I swear," Lyle returned a few minutes later with the concoction, gently holding it to Sophia's lips. She hesitated at first, but with a bit of coaxing, she took the liquid in small sips. The room was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Sophia's breathing. Jacob stayed at her side, his hand resting on her small shoulder, offering what comfort he could. Minutes passed like hours, and Jacob found himself waiting, watching, praying for a sign that the fever would break. And then, finally, it came. Sophia's body shifted under the blanket, her small hands grasping for warmth. Slowly, her feverish face relaxed, her breath deepening, the tension leaving her small body as the fever began to subside. For the first time that night, Jacob allowed himself to breathe. He looked at Lyle, who met his gaze with an unspoken understanding. The man had done something Jacob hadn't been sure he would do. And though Jacob didn't trust him, he realized something in that moment. Sophia had a chance now. She wasn't out of danger yet, but there was hope. And hope, after everything they had been through, was a luxury that Jacob would hold on to for as long as it would last. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly, his voice rough. The words didn't feel enough, but they were all he could offer. Lyle didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded, his face unreadable. He stepped back toward the fire, his figure blending into the shadows once more. The storm still howled outside, but inside the barn, for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of peace.